Welcome back to the 10,000 Heroes Show. I'm your host, Uncle Rashad Delight. This is Season 6, and get ready, everybody, because Season 6 is where we recognize not only the inevitability of conflict, but we see its transcendent potential. That's right. The only way out is through. This is a different kind of episode. I ended up meeting my guest in person, which hilariously is actually much trickier to record than meeting online. I had a video camera, I was playing with it was new. I found it really difficult for us to be both on the camera at the same time and not look weird with the whole selfie arm posture thing. Of course, the clever among you will note that it's always difficult for me not to look weird, which is true. But those logistical circumstances combined with Nala's opening remarks led me to see this interview not as a conversation, but as a series of thought-provoking polemics coming from Nala, which I was really open to because her material is so new for me. So I edited the excerpts of our conversation into 5 different video clips, which I've posted separately on YouTube, and I'll have the audio of all those during this episode. But even though you'll hear the audio now, I would say they're worth watching on YouTube because Nala has this really captivating screen presence. She has some cool clothes, and the passion that will surely come across on audio is even amplified on the video. So here are the topics she covers. 1, white people don't exist. 2, the relationship between anti-racism, ancestor work, and grief. 3, why her ancestors had to be obsessed with race. 4, how to talk to your ancestors. And 5, how grief can and should be ecstatic. So I'm going to offer a few reflections now because I don't appear much in the clips, as I already explained. And the first is that all this material is totally new to me. You know, I've really stayed away from the modern race, culture war stuff. And I think this is pretty smack dab in the middle of it. So it's out of my comfort zone, which is good. And the second is that most of this material, except for the last segment, which is arguably the most important one, is aimed at white people. And I don't identify as white. So I really have a hard time telling if this material is going to be offensive, or challenging, or just totally boring, or matter of fact, for the white listener or the listener of European ancestry, as Nala would say. Number 3, I'm really excited about the possibilities and opportunities embedded in the conflict this material hopefully creates with you. And that's the theme of this podcast this season is the conflict. So that's on message, but really it's like what I'm seeing all around me, whether it's the cold dips I'm doing, which are still incredibly painful and I experience a lot of resistance, or the Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes, or the mediation training I did with Ken Cloak, or just poking around social media a bit more than I normally do. There's just conflict everywhere. You know, conflict within us, conflict between the systems. And I really see it as this spiritual path, almost like this archway that we can kneel down and crawl through to get to the next iteration of ourselves. So I ask you, when you engage with Nala's material, to leave aside the question of whether you agree with her or whether she's objectively right, and to instead focus on what it is, if anything, you can learn from this that is going to lead to your own transcendence, your own growth, your own self-actualization. This is especially true if you experience offense or challenge or some other strong emotion. The question is then, what opportunity for transcendence is encased within that emotion? If you couldn't avoid it, if you had to go through it and you ended up on the other side, where would you arrive? Of course, for me, the most important of Nala's messages is the possibility for us to relate differently to grief. As the Buddha loves pointing out, sickness and death and poverty and loss and other forms of suffering are really human universals. Every single one of us has occasion to experience grief. But what do we do with that? Many people avoid it, or suppress it, or try to make do, or maybe just move on. But grief is something that can neither be predicted nor controlled. At my best, I feel like I can surrender to it a little bit instead of fighting it. And even that is rare. But Nala's whole invitation is something else entirely. What if the whole point of grief is to give us access to a kind of spiritual awakening? What if it's something that leads us to celebration? What if the death of a parent or a friend is a gift? What if it's all the insight from a 10-day meditation retreat without the silence? Or all the perspective from a psychedelic trip without the acid? What then? That comes in the 5th excerpt, so be patient, or skip ahead, or just check out that segment on YouTube. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm turning the floor over to Nala.
White people don't really exist if you think about it, because if race is a construct, and whiteness, from my estimation, is something that is a bleaching of culture and it's a bleaching of identity. So to say someone is like a white person, if you think of yourself as a white person, you've already been colonized and probably for thousands of years. So that isn't to say that the systems in our country and elsewhere in the world as well aren't such that white privilege is a reality that we have to deal with. But that's different than someone adopting the identity of, I am a white person. For white people to question the idea that they're white is part and parcel to doing anti-racist work. For white people to go, how is it that we came to this time and place where I'm introducing myself as a white person instead of, a Belgian person or a, Celtic person or whatever, some more tribal culture that you come from, and saying, this is who I am, from going from that to I am white, to recognize that there's an incredible poverty, in that concept, and a lot of loss and a lot of grief has happened to my ancestors for me to arrive at the place where I would say, I'm white. Wait, I'm white? How did that happen? How did I get here? There really is no such thing as white culture, because whiteness itself was an extraction of people from their indigenous places on the globe, and a bleaching of their culture until they become this kind of homogenous society that we call, white people. It's not actually a culture. So for white people to realize that the same processes of racism and destruction of languages and customs and traditions that are happening all around the globe right now also happened to, let's just say, people of European heritage who are now maybe considered white. Those same things happened to people of European heritage. It was just longer ago. There's this quote by a woman named Lila Watson, who is an activist and in Australia, I believe it is. And she said, you might know this quote, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So this is what I mean about white people questioning their own whiteness and going on a search for where do I come from? Who actually am I? Who are my people? What are the languages my people speak or spoke? What are the songs they sung? How do I speak to my ancestors? Are my ancestors gone? Are my ancestors lost? Do I actually have wisdom in my own lineage so I don't have to appropriate other people's lineages? And the answer is yes, all of those things. And if you don't do that, you show up to some type of anti-racist movement from a place of, being a do-gooder, or you're trying to be a good white person, or you're doing it out of guilt or shame at who you are, or you're doing it because you're doing them a favor, or you're doing it because, you're a philanthropist or it's a charity. All of those things are incredibly shallow, and you will become burned out in the movement, or you will be canceled, or, you won't last in any type of anti-racist work unless you realize this happened to my people too. Then you have people who can actually join hands and work together for real change, for us to realize there's one human race. We're all brothers and sisters. And if we don't start actually healing and getting along, all of us lose, you know? As far as white people are concerned, doing ancestor work, going back, learning how to listen to the voices of our ancestors, which are still present. They're actually banging on the door to try and speak to us at this point, because things are getting really, really hectic and really chaotic and confusing in our world at a rapid pace. So to be able to go back and understand what happened to European people in the past. If you have European heritage, that involves grieving. So that's a huge piece of why I do a lot of grief. I've been a lot of grief ritual with people, because you can't do ancestor work without grief work. You know, those two things go hand in hand. Yeah, this is a call for people who are working in justice movements and working in liberation movements to, if you have identified as white, to really start questioning that and get to know your own ancestors. You're not actually inhabiting your own space in the movement. You're always reaching out towards doing something for someone else instead of just rooting into it from your own experience. Like, I understand, I remember, I have ancestral memory in my blood and bones of the gallows and the torture and the Romans coming and slashing down and burning and pillaging entire villages and forbidding us to speak our own languages. Like, those traumas are embedded into the European blood and bone and flesh. And I mean, I see this in my clients, right? Because we do ancestor work and we go way back. Once you allow yourself, instead of blocking up the grief, I call it sandbagging. It's like you have this river, or the tide is rising, and you're quickly like throwing all these sandbags to, keep the grief at bay. Once you start just like allowing the grief of that after so many thousands of years, sometimes it's thousands of years since this happened, right? To stop sandbagging and allow it to wash over you, then you can start understanding justice movements as that it involves you and your own people. And then you can actually serve the movement, because otherwise you show up and it's like there's no legs under you, there's no roots, and you can just topple someone like that right over. They'll fall out of the movement pretty easily unless they're committed from their own roots, right? I come from a long line of people who have just been running and running and running and uprooted and chased and pursued and scapegoated and, for so many thousands of years based on our race. From what I can tell, Jews were the first people on the planet to be racialized. Like, the concept of race was invented and laboratoried and perfected diabolically on Jewish bodies, right? Like, we were chased all through, through the Middle East and up into Europe and uprooted over and over and over again over there. And the institutionalization of racism was, they figured all that out by experimenting with it all throughout Europe on Jewish people. And only then was it exported to the Americas, to Africa, to Australia.
Right, like a really refined, excellent form.
And then adding in the color piece.
Yeah.
Then it was colorized, then made it even more dastardly.
Right.
But from what I can feel in myself, the reason why I am always thinking about these topics is because that's how my people survived, is by wondering about this thing called race. Like, if I would not be here if my ancestors weren't, you know, thinking about this thing from every single angle and trying to figure it out and stay a step ahead of the game.
Like when you talk about speaking to your ancestors,
Right.
is this a dream? Is this a psychedelic ritual? Is this meditation? Is it somatic experiencing therapy? Like,
Yeah.
how's it work? What's happening?
Yeah, it's ritual. It's a ritual journey where you basically get into an altered state. It's essentially through meditation, breath, and just setting that intention, making that prayer that you be open to receive messages from your ancestors. And it's actually not rocket science. Anyone can do that. You don't have to be some kind of a special medium or some kind of a shaman to hear the voices of your ancestors. That's part of the colonization process, is that we've been taught that, your ancestors are gone, your ancestors are lost. There's no way you can contact them unless you're some kind of a, have some kind of special psychic abilities. Not true at all. It used to be just basic daily hygiene, that you would say prayers and, listen to what your ancient voices are saying to you. And when I say voice, it's not necessarily that you hearing an actual voice. It might just be that you have a knowing. You just take a moment to focus and hear, and you just know something that your ancestors are communicating, or you feel it somatically, or you might see an image, something like that. And the more that you do that, the more that you cultivate that ability, the easier and more natural it gets. It's like you build a relationship with your ancestors. Ideally, the ones who are well, wise, benevolent, the ones that have your best interests in mind, that want you to not only be true to the path that you were meant to walk in this world, like while you have the blessing of being in this precious earth and in this precious human body. It's a short and precious gift that we get, is it not? Yeah. So this used to be just some of the most basic daily hygiene in that way, that you would connect with your ancestral wisdom before making a decision to turn left or right. You're going to check in with yourself. So yeah, it's part of a decolonial project for all of us, or any of us, especially people who have been taught that, you're white, you don't have any culture, and you don't really come from anywhere, and
And your only relationship to colonialism is as a perpetrator.
Yes. Once white people realize that they have a whole lot of, rape and pillage and burning and, stealing and all of those things in their own heritage, then we're really going to get into the solidarity business at that point. We really need solidarity rather than charity. So there's a lot of people who are starting to realize how hungry they are for something real, and starting to kind of the identity of like white person is starting to kind of crumble. And that's the kind of people that I like to work with. Grief can be incredibly ecstatic. If you think about what happens when you're making love, there's a lot of fluid and there's breath and there's movement, there's sound that happens. And the same thing happens when you're grieving. It's a very moist process. And if you're really letting it have its way with you, you can really get to a place of ecstatic union with the divine. You can get to that place where you're both laughing and crying at the same time. It's a place of deep alchemy and deep connection with all that is, with all the grieving people that are on the planet at that moment. It can feel afterwards like the same or similar as you feel after you were with a lover, because you feel like just spent, and you feel kind of your whole body is humming and vibrating, and it's a skill to allow yourself to be able to really get there, where because we are taught that grieving is just something that you have to push away, or it's a slog and it's something you have to get through, and it's a punishment that, and you can wallow and collapse into this really degraded position. Or if we reframe it, we can start to feel the opportunity that we have, and we for sure have ample opportunities these days, because grievous things are happening all over the world, and we certainly have tons of ancestral grief. It's, I really believe we've been given this much grief because we need more portals to enter ecstatic states. We have a very workaholic overculture that we're dealing with, where we're just go, and we don't have a lot of time and space that we value to enter that unitive consciousness. And if we don't, I believe it's a deep human need to enter that ecstatic state, where you kind of forgetting about, the small you. You're forgetting about the busyness of your life, and you enter a completely different realm. And we evolved with rituals that took us to those places through many ways, through drumming and dancing and sweating and, plant medicines, and all of these ways that people evolved with going into these deep states of trance. And because we are so busy, we're too busy for that now in our modern days. The world keeps dumping on more and more grief. And if we look at that as an opportunity to enter that portal, then I think we'll be getting somewhere.
Thanks again, everybody. My hope is that this episode was somewhat intense for you, and that you let me know exactly how intense, either through email, or giving me a call, or through SpeakPipe, or through a comment on YouTube. Thanks again for listening. Thus concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes Show. On behalf of myself and Martine, my producer, thank you for listening. And if you never want to miss another episode, if you want to have transcripts of everything you've heard, if you want to be in delightful one-on-one communication with me, and you want to hear about upcoming live events, sign up for our newsletter. You can go to momentumlab.com/podcast and get all the information.